Hello and welcome back to another episode of the We Are Sunderland podcast. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see that it's a bit of a special episode this afternoon because we're joined by Sunderland's club historian, Rob Mason. How are you doing, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. Delighted to have you on. We're
My
doing it
pleasure.
because it's people who might have seen on the site, we've got a bit of a feature running at the moment because, as you very well know, it's 25 years since Sunderland's record-breaking, historic 105-point promotion-winning season of the old First Division. James Hunter, our colleague, he's done a couple of cracking articles with Michael Gray, Kevin Ball, Peter Reid. If you haven't seen them, make sure you get over to We Are Sunderland, subscribe for £1 and get them read because, you know, they're really good pieces from James. And this is adding to that series as well. We're going to delve back into your brain and your mind and your thoughts on that season, Rob, if you don't mind. But I guess before we do get going with it, you know, some supporters might be listening to this, watching this, and just wondering how you sort of got into the position that you got into with being the club's historian, and you know what it involves, and I guess why really, what interests you about it.
All right. Okay. Well, we go back to at the time. I'm going to show my age now. At the time I was born, Sunderland had never ever been relegated from the top flight, and were the only club never to have been relegated from the top flight. Sadly, I was born too late because 2 months after I was born, they were relegated, and after the previous 50, 60 years of fantastic eras of success. Obviously, in my lifetime, there's been as many relegations as promotions, and relegation or promotion at the point I was born was never a word that Sunderland had to use.
So you think it's all your fault, Rob?
It's all my fault. My brother was born in 1964, so the year he was born, we were promoted, and he never fails to let me forget that they were relegated the year I was born and promoted the year he was born. But at the age of 8, or in fact shortly before my 9th birthday, I went to my first game. And my first game, Sunderland won 7-1, and they were 4-0 up in 27 minutes. And as an 8-year-old, I thought it was like that every week. And I had to wait another 20 years of going every week to see them score 7 again. And then they did it twice in 3 weeks at that point. I think as I sit here now, I think I've seen Sunderland score 7 on 5 occasions. And one of them was in the 98-99 season we're going to talk about. So I started going then in February 1967. And from 1970, when I went to my first away game at Carlisle, that same season, which was just after they'd been relegated for the second time, in fact, shortly before they were relegated for the second time, I stopped from going every now and then when I had the money. And to be fair, my mum and dad would always give me the money if I wanted to go. But I started shortly before they were relegated for the second time in 1970. I started going to every game. Every home game, and I started going to away games around about, I think it was October 1970, when I went to a midweek goalless draw at Carlisle. But from early in 1970, I was going every single week. And as people who are my age will know, at that time Sunderland were bleak. Between that relegation season of 1970 and when Bob Stokoe came along at the end of 1972 and went on to win the Cup, of course, that year. It was one of the lowest points in Sunderland's history. The crowds were really down. There was a huge area or feeling of disillusionment around the town in terms of the football team. The town, not for the first or last time, was very much down on its heels as a place. So it was quite a depressing place, and the football team were doing nothing to lift that depression. But being a young lad at that age, by 1970, I'd be about 12. At that age, I was, of course, as keen as mustard, and I was going every week. And I was always optimistic, no matter how badly they'd been playing. I was always optimistic that Sunderland were going to win. I've always been a glass half full kind of person, particularly when it comes to Sunderland Football Club. So from those beginnings, I was a very, very keen supporter. And I never, ever, ever went to the match without buying a programme, because it was the programme and the old Football Echo, sadly no longer with us for the last 10 years. It was the programme and the Football Echo that would really give you all the information you could get about Sunderland Football Club, because, of course, this was decades before that thing called the internet sprung up, let alone podcasts or anything. They just didn't exist.
Yeah.
So I always would get the programme and I would always read the print of it. And I did that for several years. And then in 1985, by which time I'd become an English teacher, and I'd been teaching for 5 years. In 1985, there was a little note in the back of the programme And it simply said, if anybody's got any ideas for next season's programme, we'd love to hear them. So I wrote in with 27 ideas, and I got a letter back inviting me down to a meeting at Roker Park with the then commercial manager, an absolutely tremendous man, sadly no longer with us, a man called Alec King, who was a great fella. And I was thrilled to bits. I was absolutely over the moon. And I went down to this meeting thinking, this will be the only time in my life I go to a meeting at Roker Park. And in the meeting, there was myself, Alec King, another chap who wrote under the name of Harry Barrett, and who Alec had known from his previous club, Grimsby Town. And at the end of that meeting, Harry Barrett was basically writing everything on the visitors and one or two other things. Alec was looking after all the adverts, and I'd been asked to write all the stuff on Sunderland. Now, the programme in those days was a much smaller beast than it became in the years when I edited it. But I started working on the programme then in sort of 86, having written it in 85. And I've written for the programme ever since. I spent about 20 years working full-time at the football club, editing the programme and so on, and editing the club magazine and the junior magazine, or the old 24/7 magazine, all that sort of stuff. Started writing books on Sunderland Football Club. As I say, I left teaching in the year 2000 to go full-time at the football club. And when I left the football club in 2017, I was made redundant when they were relegated from the Premier League. I was one of 40-odd people made redundant when Martin Bain was the chief executive. And let me get my little dig in. Martin Bain was chief executive for 2 years, and Sunderland finished bottom of the league in both of the years Martin Bain was chief executive. So you can gather my thoughts on the man who made me redundant. Not my favourite person. But at the same time, in fairness to him, at the same time that they made me redundant, they asked me if I would stay on, not working full time, but as the club historian. Because I'd become the club historian during the years I worked at the football club, because people had soon learned that if they needed to know anything about the history of Sunderland Football Club, they always used to come and see me and ask me. So there was, I'd started to do lots of things on a historical line. So, for example, long before I left the football club, I took it upon myself to do things like, I thought, a lot of people know where Roker Park was, but a lot of them, as years go on, a lot of younger people won't know where Roker Park was, let alone know where the previous grounds were, the grounds they played at, in the early years of the football club. So I'd taken it upon myself to do things like get blue plaques put up on the site of all of Sunderland's former grounds, and do historical things like that. So anyway, I became the club historian like that. So these days, I still am the main contributor to the programme. I tend to write about 11, 12 pages in the programme these days. I just no longer edit it. But I'm the club historian, so I do all sorts of things like I set up the Sunderland Hall of Fame. I proposed and drove the campaign to get the 1973 team the freedom of the city, all that sort of stuff. And I answer endless queries, some of them very obscure, from people on a weekly basis, sometimes a daily basis, that come into the club. They all get forwarded onto me. So in a nutshell, that's my background, and that's where I am now as the club historian.
Was that a difficult decision to stay on when they asked you to do that?
Good question, Joe. A lot of people ask me that, because it would have been the easiest thing in the world to just take the hoof, walk away, and never go back. And I thought, well, that's just going to cut me nose off to spite me face, because a good friend of mine, Peter Rogers, who had been my counterpart at Norwich City, and a very good friend of mine, Paul Tully, God rest his soul, who had been my counterpart at Newcastle United as programme editor, not as club historian. Paul was a great friend of mine. For decades, whenever Sunderland played Newcastle, be it at first team level, reserve team level, and it was reserve teams in those days, or under 18 level, whether it was at Sunderland or whether it was on Tyneside, Paul and I would watch those games together and keep each other right. And he was a big help to me. He was much more experienced than me when I started. So anyway, when both Peter Rogers got made redundant at Norwich, and when Paul Tully got made redundant at Newcastle, they both decided they weren't going to go back for a while, or ever, really. And Peter Rogers at Norwich said to me, he said, Rob, he says, I was made redundant by a chief executive at Norwich who will be there for 5 minutes. Norwich mean nothing to him, and he's gone. But he's taken away, something I was very passionate about. And I decided, no, I wasn't going to do that. Sunderland was my club. It had been my club for decades before Martin Bain came on the scene. And it'll be my club for many years after Martin Bain left the scene and went to the Indian Premier League. And I know his job was to reduce the staff. They were trying to slim it down to get it ready for sale, as Alice Short was trying to sell it. So I thought, I'm a Sunderland supporter first and foremost. That's all I've ever been. It's all I ever will be. I'm just a Sunderland supporter like everybody else. So I'm going to keep going, and I've kept going, and it was a good decision to make, because those people who made me redundant have long since gone. They're largely forgotten about, and the club will go through its ups and its downs, its highs and its lows, and I'll be there to witness them for as long as I'm on this mortal coil, basically. Sadly, as we all know, some of them have got more downs than ups generally, and more low times than good times. But I always think that you've got to have experienced the poor times to really get the true excitement of the great times. I think if you support, a team who are winning the league year in, year out, you can become quite blasé about it. I went to the 2012 Cup final between Chelsea and Liverpool, and I was in with the Chelsea supporters. And when they won the Cup, their fans all disappeared. All the ones around me disappeared. I mean, they obviously had a long way to go home, on the tube. And I said, "Where are you going?" And they said, "Oh, we're missing the crowds. We've seen us win the Cup before." I'm thinking, if this was Sunderland, you'd be an hour or two later, you'd be trying to get the crowd out.
There's been a lot of throwing at Manchester City recently, hasn't there? The fourth title.
Exactly. So, when you do experience the lows, it means the highs are, in my opinion, much higher.
And just before we're going to get that high, just to sort of wrap up your bit, I suppose the beauty of it as well is with history and things like that, it never stops, does it? It's always evolving, and you've always got the here and now to compare to something else, don't you?
I think that's a great point, because people very often talk to me about history and think that the only thing I'm interested in is things from 100 years or more ago. And that's absolutely not true. Yes, I am very interested in history of approaching 150 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. But I'm every bit as interested in what's going to happen next. What in a year's time will be history. A year's time from now, when you sit down to do a podcast with whoever this time next year, they'll be looking back on the 24-25 season, looking at whoever Sunderland did finally appoint as the head coach, who they did sign, who they didn't sign, who they did sell, how things went. There's another year's history to be written. Hopefully, it will be a year that will take Sunderland back into the Premier League. I know that looks an awful long way off at the moment, but a club of Sunderland stature have got to get back to the Premier League ASAP. We've already been out of the top flight for longer than we ever have been in our history. And every single day that passes without Sunderland being back in the top flight is disgraceful, in my opinion. Sunderland should never have been allowed to drop out of the Premier League, let alone into the depths and the horrors of that cesspit of cheating that was League One. And we need to get back into the Premier League and be able to stay there.
Absolutely echo those thoughts. And at risk of going off on a tangent where we could do a complete other podcast, we'll bring it round to why we are here and that season that, it still stands the test of time, doesn't it? 25 years on, I'm reading James's bit with Kevin Ball, but they've all said it. That season, no matter how long it continues to be in the rearview mirror, supporters, players, everyone involved keep going back to that season. 105 points, a record at the time. Only one team have gone better, Reading. Just everything about it. You mentioned earlier the mood around the town, and I live in Sunderland myself, so I get that vibe every other Saturday. Whatever has happened at the stadium, you can sense it in the town.
Yeah.
That point, it just felt like, even after the playoff final defeat, what then happened over the next sort of 3 or 4 years going into the Premier League as well.
Yeah.
It was a special time for the club, wasn't
it? Well, you're right to mention the playoff final defeat from the year before, because in the 97-98 season, the first at the Stadium of Light, after Sunderland had been relegated as Roker Park closed, we had a difficult start, to put it mildly, a very difficult start, but then got onto a tremendous run. And if I remember rightly, we had 90 points. 90 points would normally be enough to take you up at that time. And we ended up finishing third. I remember late in the season, we went to Nottingham Forest. It was on my birthday. It was my 40th birthday. and I was still teaching at the time, but I just had time to let me class out a minute or two early, jump into the car in Durham where I was teaching, belt down to Nottingham and get there, a quarter of an hour or so before kickoff. And I remember before the game, a good friend of mine, Bill Mantle, who, that's a name some people might remember, he used to cover Sunderland for the radio station Sun FM, and I used to travel to away games with him. But on this particular occasion, Bill had obviously gone before me, and I'd made my way down. It was a midweek game. And Bill gave me a birthday card signed by all the players and said, "We're going to win 3-0, Rob." And Nottingham Forest were top of the league, and they were good to their word. They did win 3-0. And actually, you mentioned Kevin Ball there. In my opinion, that was one of Kevin Ball's best ever games for Sunderland. He absolutely mullered them in midfield. Nobody from the Nottingham Forest shirt was allowed to have the ball. Ball, he was just going to take it off them. And Sunderland were brilliant. They played Nottingham Forest off the park. But Forest had such a good start, and Middlesbrough had done so well that we just couldn't quite catch them, despite a superb volley from Kevin Phillips and Swindon on the final day when we won. It wasn't quite enough, and Middlesbrough just edged us out of the second promotion spot. And we ended up, obviously, in the playoffs. We ended up in the 4-4 with Charlton Athletic. We ended up, of course, with the Michael Gray penalty. I'm sure Michael's spoken about that in the piece that he's done with James. I've spoken to Michael about it myself many times over the years. And we were unlucky in that final. But what was particularly notable in that final was a fan's hero and somebody I really liked, the goalkeeper, Lionel Perez, the French goalkeeper, had come for a cross that was nowhere near his in the last minute of the 90, or just about the last minute of the 90. Richard Rufus scored, the defender scored what, if I remember rightly, was his first professional goal. And Sunderland went on, obviously, to just draw. Remember that we'd had Kevin Phillips and, if I remember rightly, Lee Clark substituted in that game through injuries. Two players who would have taken and probably scored penalties in the penalty shootout. And the biggest change Reedy made in the summer, he made several changes, but the biggest one was to sign a new goalkeeper in Thomas Sorensen. Mm-hmm. Now, I spoke to Lionel Perez. He's in France now. I spoke to him on a video call maybe about 18 months ago. It was for a piece I was doing for the Sunderland programme. Mm-hmm. I remember Lionel talking to me in depth about the penalty shootout. And he said that he tried hard to get the first 3 penalties, but he said, I could get nowhere near them. And he astonished me by saying, after the 3rd penalty, he said, all of the energy just went out of my body, and I didn't think I was going to save anything. And that stunned me that A, he would think that, and B, he would admit that, albeit all these years later. And Lionel was a great character. Don't forget, we'd got to that final at Wembley against Swindon because he'd made the best double save by a Sunderland goalkeeper since 1973 Cup final with Jimmy Montgomery. He'd made the best double save seen by a Sunderland goalkeeper in the second leg of the playoff against Sheffield United. But Reedy needed a new keeper, and he signed Thomas Sorensen. And the biggest difference, if you look at the 2 seasons, is in the 105-point season, we scored very, very few extra goals to what we'd scored in 97-98. But we conceded only just about half as many, slightly more than half as many, because Reedy had brought in Thomas Sorensen. He'd brought in Paul Butler, the big proper stopper centre-half. There was no frills about Paul Butler. You could not see him fitting into the modern-day game where people want to take faffing about goal kicks in the 6-yard, and play out their own penalty area. That's not Paul's game.
Yeah.
But for me, being old-fashioned, I like exciting attackers and boring defenders. And Paul Butler was a boring defender, but he was a good defender. Not much was going to get past him because, he was powerful in the air. He was physically strong. He was a proper old centre-half, a bit like a Danny Bath centre-half, who we had a year ago. And with the introduction of Paul Butler at centre-half, and particularly Thomas Sorensen in goal, we really tightened up the defence, and we had a record number of clean sheets in that season. I think, including cup ties, it was something like 30 clean sheets. I think Thomas Sorensen had 29 of them, and Andy Marriott got his 1 clean sheet when he played at Grimsby Town. So that was the preamble to that 98-99 105-point season. is important when you try and put it into context because of what had gone before. We'd gone so close the year before. And I think a lot of the players now, with the benefit of hindsight, think if they'd gone up in 97, 98, it might have been a year too early. They wouldn't have had the impact they did have on the Premier League once they got up. Bear in mind, there was those 2 seventh place finishes once Sunderland were promoted after the 105 points. And in both of those seventh place finishes, there's still to this day a bit of a feeling that really Sunderland could and should have finished higher, because midway through the season they were much higher and in with a serious chance of a Champions League place.
Absolutely, and you're totally right to mention those players, because that's been a theme from the interviews that we've put out on My Sunderland already. Yeah. Sorensen and Butler coming in. You mentioned the numbers there: 25 league clean sheets, 30 in total.
Yeah.
Only 3 defeats as well. 28 goals conceded all season. They're just remarkable figures, aren't they? One promotion by 18 points, 19 points to automatic. The third place, sorry, 91 goals. The list can just go on and on. Mm. It is an unprecedented season, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this year we have been celebrating the 60th anniversary of Sunderland's first promotion season. I mentioned my brother was born in '64. And of course, Charlie Hurley, the club's player of the century, has just passed away, and Charlie captained that team. Now, that team, the 64 team, were a much, much loved Sunderland team, partly because they were the first ever promotion team after a couple of very, very near misses in 62 and 63, and partly because in those days, it was the days before substitutes. So if you played the full 90 minutes. Not like these days where there's 27 subs, you can bring 25 of them on and you lose count of who's playing. And week in, week out, it was the same team. None of this were feeling tired stuff. You'd play 3 games in 4 days over Easter, and by and large, it would be the same 11 lads out 3 games in a row, as it would be for the opposition. And that 64 team, Sunderland supporters of that vintage can reel them off from 1 to 11, without batting an eyelid, as they can for the 73 Cup team. They were Sunderland's 2 most loved teams since the war. But hot on their heels, and quite rightly so, is that 105-point team. Mm-hmm. It was largely the same 11 through most of the season. I think we have to remember that the key men in the team at the beginning of the season, the front 2 of Quinn and Phillips, both missed large chunks of the season. Yeah. And goodness knows how many points they would have had if Kevin Phillips and Niall Quinn had played every game, or just about every game.
Yeah, that was a point that I was going to bring up. With those 2 being injured, Danny Dichio and Michael Bridges came in and did a really important role. 3 of the players that season got over 10 goals.
Yeah, well, Michael Bridges is one of the, in some respects, is one of the saddest Sunderland stories. And I'm not talking about his injury. That was sad enough, the injury he got once he was transferred to Leeds. But what's really sad about Michael, and goodness knows, would we love a Michael Bridges coming through the youth team now? I remember Michael Bridges scoring 5 goals in a 10-0 win at the Charlie Hurley Centre for the under-18s. I think it was against Chesterfield. And he was a brilliant forward, an absolutely brilliant forward. And yet, over the years, since Michael Bridges, and to some extent for a lot of years before Michael Bridges, although the youth team have produced some fantastic players, look at Dan Neil, Anthony Patterson, and Chris Rigg all in the first team now for current examples. We haven't really produced a top-class striker.
Yeah.
We've produced top-class goalkeepers. Have a look at the Euros. You might see some fella called Pickford in goal. Have a look at people who've lifted the Champions League trophy in recent years. You might see somebody called Jordan Henderson lifting it. But we haven't produced a top-class striker. And yet when we did produce a top-class striker, he couldn't get in the team because we had an even better striker in the man who was about to go on and win the European Golden Shoe in Kevin Phillips.
Yeah.
But when Phillips wasn't available, you had stick man Michael Bridges to come in. And while Danny Dichio was not everybody's cup of tea and was certainly not anywhere near the same class as Niall Quinn, my goodness, if we'd had Danny Dichio last season, we'd have thought we had Pele compared to the centre forwards we did have. So as a backup strike force, Dichio and Bridges were absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
And I mean, to go into the season as well, beyond some of the stats, what are some of the games that stand out? I mean, briefly touched on the Oxford game earlier on in the conversation. I'm assuming that's one of them. I've actually got the book of yours. I've got a copy of the absolute record here. In prior to this, and the match of the season that's listed in here is the 3-2 win away at West Brom, which is listed as the 500th away win in Sunderland's history.
Yeah,
just sort of the games that stand out to you. Are those two up there?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, it certainly is, because I wrote that book, so I picked the matches of the season. And yeah, the West Brom game where they came from 2-0 down to win 3-2, and the 3 goals were all fairly late in the game, was a classic example of that team where never knew when they were beaten. They never knew when they were beaten. And okay, we're 2-0 down, we're away from home, it's 20 minutes left or whatever. We're not going to look for a point here, we think we can win. And why not, with the team that we had and the confidence that we had? For me, the game that stands out the most is the one where we actually clinched promotion at Bury in the 5-2 win. I mean, the whole season was just a parade, really, from start to finish. Of we're fed up with the fact that we've lost the playoff final. We're fed up with the fact that we've lost the playoff final on penalties after a 4-4 draw. Everybody knows about the speech Quinny gave in the dressing room after the game at Wembley, saying we'll come back bigger and better and stronger next year. I've already mentioned the strengthening that Peter Reid did over the summer, particularly in terms of the goalkeeper and the centre half. But we started off that season like we meant it, and we never let up, as you say, 3 defeats in 46 games. But for me, the overriding memory is the Bury game, because we scored 5 goals, we won 5-2. But I remember downstairs in the tunnel after the game and down by the dressing rooms, I was lucky enough to be sort of in and around the dressing room after the final whistle. And there was a big sign that said, Nationwide League Division 1, that Quinny was taking great pleasure in kicking to bits and karate chopping to bits and sticking the boot in and smashing it all up and thinking, we don't need this. We're not in this league anymore. Quinny, then being Quinny, of course, it was then full of apologies and going to see the people at Bury, apologise for the damage he'd done and offer to pay for it. That would be Quinny, But that was a brilliant night. We'd completed the job, no matter how far you are ahead in the league, and we were miles and miles ahead in the league. You always want to be over the line. You always want to be over the line, and that was the game that took them over the line. And that and the celebrations were just fantastic. And of course, a few years later we were back at Bury. This was the game before Roy Keane was appointed, of course, when Quinny was manager, and we'd lost the first 3-4 league games of the season. Bury were bottom of the entire football league. They were the only team in the league with a worse record than us. And then after Arnau was sent off after 3 minutes, we got beat 2-0, and everybody was as flat as they could be after Quinny and the Drummerville consortium had taken over. And Quinny stood sidelines that night and said, we're going to have a world-class figure in charge as manager in a few days' time. And everybody's wondering, who is it? Not knowing who it was, and Quinny wouldn't tell us. But those 2 moments at Gig Lane always stick in my memory. One was at the highest of highs, that 5-2 win that took us over the line in what became the 105-point season. And then a few years later, one of the lowest of the lows. But again, it was a turning point, because it was straight after that Sunderland went on to bigger and better things, albeit I'm not forgetting that Quinny had his one remaining match with Roy in the stands, which they won before Roy took over.
I suppose that's just Sunderland in a nutshell, isn't it? Those 2 games there, the highs and the lows, as you say. And I think it's interesting as well. Kevin Ball's piece for these features, he touches on when promotion was secured, there was still 4 or 5 games left. Yeah. And he made the absolute utmost that Sunderland weren't going to get beat in those final 4 or 5 games after what happened in the previous season. Yeah. And they went out and I think they won 4, drew 1, and obviously lifted the trophy against Birmingham. That's just the mentality, isn't it, that team had?
Well, I'm presuming that Bawley's told this story in the piece he's done with James, but I haven't seen it. But I mean, Kevin and I go back a long way from when. I remember when Kevin was signed by Dennis Smith in 1990, before I'd ever met Bawley. I said to Dennis, but remember Bawley was a centre half when he was signed.
Yeah.
And remember, Dennis Smith, the manager, had been not only a centre half himself for Stoke, but a very good one. The sort of centre half I was talking about, Paul Butler or Danny Barthby, he was a big. You can throw. He's the kind of centre half that you felt you could throw a fridge into the box, and Dennis was going to head it away. But I said to Dennis, I says, "This centre half you've signed, Dennis." He says, "Yes, Rob." I says, "He's a bit little. He's only 5'9" for a centre half, and I don't think Dennis had realised he was only 5'9." But he became a great centre half. He was an excellent centre half before he got moved into midfield, and in my opinion, was an even better midfielder. But in all the time I've been gone, and I do include Charlie Hurley in this. I do include Charlie, although to be fair, I only saw Charlie in the last 2 or 3 years of his career. Remember, I said I started going 67. In my opinion, Kevin Ball is the best captain that Sunderland have had in my lifetime. And he was the best captain because A, he led by example. And B, every time Kevin Ball stepped onto the pitch, every other player in the team was 5 to 10% better than they would be if Kevin Ball was not in the team. Because they knew Kevin would kill them if they didn't give 101% absolutely from the first minute to the last. Quite apart from what Kevin was like off the pitch and how great he was off the pitch with everybody.
Yeah.
But Kevin was due to be suspended for that last game against Birmingham when they raised the league raised the league championship trophy. And Kevin had to go to a tribunal. I think tribunal is the right word, a disciplinary hearing.
Yeah.
To talk about why he should not be suspended for the game. And he explained to them he'd had however many bookings, let's say it was 10, something like that. He'd had 10 bookings, wherever it was in the season. He explained to them, he says, look, in my position as a holding midfielder, my job is to get the ball. Over 46 games or whatever, I'm bound to have a few mistimed tackles, And he said, look, I want to be on the pitch. We've won the league. I want to be on the pitch. I want to make sure that when I'm lifting that trophy, I'm not coming out in my blazer and my club tie, but I've got my strip on. And it's not a clean strip because I've sat in the stands and then just got changed out of my tracksuit that I've played. And it's a good job Bawley did. They did let Bawley play. And it's a good job he did play because in that final game against Birmingham, the team were 1-0 down at half-time. And Bawley was not going to come out and lift the league trophy after a defeat. We all see teams who win the league and then go off it. When Sunderland were relegated to League One, remember the last game was against Wolves. Mm-hmm. Wolves had 99 points. They were already promoted. Wolves needed 1 point to go up to, sorry, not 1 point to go up, 1 point, they were already up, 1 point to get 100 points. And they were on the beach. They got beat by a rubbish Sunderland team who scored, if I remember rightly, 3 goals against them. There's a great example of a team who've won the league and then they've downed tools. There was no way the 105-point team would down tools under Kevin Ball. And from 1-0 down at half-time, with theoretically nothing to play for, Bawley drove them on, they drove themselves on, came back to win 2-1, get that 105 points. And when Bawley was lifting that trophy, he was lifting it on the back of a win. That's captaincy.
Absolutely, and characters like that, but it's the partnerships as well. And you spoke about people who came in, but there was partnerships all over the field, wasn't there? There was Kevin Ball in midfield alongside Lee Clark and Alex Ray. You had Mickey Gray, Alan Johnson down the left, Chris Make and Nick on the right, Quinn and Phillips up front, Butler Melville in the middle. Everywhere you looked, there was a solid base, wasn't there?
Yeah, I'm very pleased you mentioned that because that was the one point I was going to make a point of making during this broadcast. Partnerships are very, very important in football. And you're lucky if you've got a dynamic partnership in the team. We think of the team that were promoted the first time they were promoted from the third division in 88, with the G-force of Gates and Gabbiadini, who then took us up to the I nearly said the Premier League. It wasn't the Premier League in those days. It was just before the Premier League. Took us to 2 promotions in 3 years. The defining partnership of that team was the G-force. You look at the promotion team of 1980, the defining partnership was the centre-backs of Jeff Clark and Sean Elliott. And I'm not forgetting Sean Elliott spent a good chunk of that season in midfield. But when they were together, as a partnership, as centre-halves, Clark and Elliott, I'm not saying they were the best 2 centre-halves we've had in my lifetime. That would be Charlie Hurley and Dave Watson. But as a combination, as a partnership, Jeff Clark and Sean Elliott were the best partnership. You're lucky if you've got one or two partnerships like that in a team. As you've just mentioned, Joe, the 105-point team had partnerships right through the pitch. You know, we look at Quinn and Phillips up front, or indeed Bridges and Diccio as backups, who we've just mentioned. You look at the flanks with, you know, Macon and Summerby on the right, Mickey Gray and Magic Johnson on the left, and so on. You look at the partnerships in midfield, and it was a combination of Lee Clark, Bowley, and Alex Ray. They all played in the side throughout the season, had a substantial number of games. But wherever the combination was, the combination worked. And likewise at the back with Andy Melville and Paul Butler, they were terrific. Everywhere you looked in the team, it was, you know, pairs of people who knew what they were doing, who had almost telepathic style understandings, not least Quinn and Phillips and Johnson and Gray.
One thing as well that almost gets overlooked about this season just because of how good the league was. This team got to the semi-final of the League Cup as well,
and really
just adding to how good the campaign was.
And that was despite the fact that it was one of those early League Cup ties against Chester, if I remember rightly, where Kevin Phillips had got his injury.
Yes,
and
it was.
You would think your top striker didn't really need to be playing against Chester City in an early round of the League Cup, but that was the kind of team that they were. They wanted to play.
Now, would you? Yeah, you wouldn't say that now.
No, of course not. You wouldn't expect it to see it. But then Sunderland, I remember before the semi-final, and Leicester City, as you'll know, were managed by Martin O'Neill. And before the semi-final, there was a press conference held at the Ramside Hotel where Martin O'Neill and Peter Reid were there as a joint press conference. Yeah. And, you know, I remember Martin talking about his lifetime love of Sunderland and so on. And when Martin, I must say that of all the managers I ever dealt with at Sunderland, and I've dealt with most of the managers for the last pushing 40 years, Peter Reid's always my favourite. Absolutely always my favourite. But Martin O'Neill is one of the other ones that's right up there. Martin O'Neill was absolutely great. But his lifetime love of Sunderland didn't extend to not kicking us off the park in the second leg at Filbert Street. Because in the first leg at the Stadium of Light, Leicester City completely outclassed us. Tony Cotty, if I remember rightly, scored a couple of goals for Leicester. Gavin McCann got Sunderland's goal. But we were well outplayed. And I remember going to Filbert Street for the second leg, was already a goal down and thinking, we've got next to no chance here. And we were winning at half-time, and we deserved to be winning at half-time. We were miles better than Leicester City. And Leicester put Robbie Savage on as a sub. And Robbie Savage showed absolutely no interest in the ball whatsoever. But he was the single biggest difference from the first half to the second half, because he stopped us playing. And Leicester came back, and Leicester went through and went on to knock us out of the League Cup. Otherwise, we might well have had a cup final, and who knows, maybe even a cup win to go with it. Similar story again at the 64 team, who famously took the holders Manchester United to 2 replays. Remember those things, replays? 2 replays, let alone a second replay, in the quarter final of the FA Cup, and that was after the 64 team had knocked the reigning league champions Everton out in the 5th round. So again, a promotion season combined with an absolutely fabulous cup run.
Just conscious of time here as well, where does this season rank for you personally? What takeaways do you have from it as a fan, as someone who works with the club, when you look back on it, thinking back to the experience that you mentioned, running down the road to Nottingham, you know, at that time? Where does it sit for you?
Obviously, a great season in terms of a highly successful season. In the years I've been watching Sunderland, I've not counted them up, but it's, you know, come 2027, it'll be 60, put it that way, that I've been going to the match. Obviously, head and shoulders above everything else is 1973. The 1990 season, where although we were promoted after we lost at Wembley, and we were promoted because of Swindon's attempt to get their club name changed to Swindletown, you know. But given the G-forces decimation of Newcastle in the playoff semi-final at Newcastle, that's a favourite season of mine. I was, as I said, I started going 67. So although I've talked a bit about the 64 season, it was before my time. So I would say my favourite seasons, I've never been asked this question before, but thinking about it, my favourite seasons would be 1973, 1990, and this particular season, the 98-99 season, closely followed by the 2 seasons after that, where we were punching our weight up at the top end of the Premier League for the only time ever, and the only time we've punched our weight at the top of the top league in my lifetime. Obviously, at one time, Sunderland were, the biggest team around.
That was why I asked the question, actually, because Peter Reid, in the piece that he did with us, he goes to those 2 7th-placed finishes, those 2 seasons, and he looks back at those perhaps more fondly, just, I guess, because of the standard, and like you rightly say there, you could say punching above the weight in the top flight, but supporters will often go back to this one. And is it because of those partnerships? I know success is obviously
the football was a joy to a lesser extent, but still a very high extent. Just over a year ago, when we were finishing 6th in the Championship, having won the playoffs the year before. I know we won the playoffs under Alex Neil, but when we were doing well in the Championship under Tony Mowbray, it was a period where everybody was really looking forward to going to the match, because in the Tony Mowbray era, you might go to the match and you might not win, but you would know that if you went to 10 matches, you'd see 8 good ones.
Yeah,
and there would be a lot of good, attractive, attacking football. And it was like that in 98, 99, except you would know that if you went to 10 matches, you'd probably win 10. And if it was bad, you might win 9, you know. But it was attacking, bright football. Obviously, I mean, Quinn and Phillips, whether you were in league, whether you were in the Championship or whatever it was called then, Nationwide Division 1, or whether you were in the Premier League then, I would not have swapped Quinn and Phillips for any partnership in the country. Whoever was playing for Arsenal, Manchester United, or whatever, keep them. Brilliant players. I'm not stupid. Some people might think I am stupid, but I wouldn't have swapped Quinn and Phillips for anybody. And the fact that Phillips got into the Premier League and then scored 30 goals and was Europe's top scorer, is my evidence for that Quinn and Phillips were as good as anybody. And Quinny himself, I think, scored something like 14 in that season when Super Kev got 30. So it was a brilliant time. Having said that, Mike, in answer to your question, I enjoy most seasons. I wouldn't quite go so far as to say I enjoy every season. This last season, for instance, the latter part of the season, I've not enjoyed at all. Even years when we're battling relegation, and don't quite succeed in battling relegation in a sort of a morbid kind of way, I even quite enjoy those seasons. What I don't enjoy is seasons where I don't think we're trying our best.
Yeah.
And the season where we went down with 19 points, not the season. The season we went down with 15 points. We did try our best. Every single player tried his best. They just weren't good enough. But those lads, the Danny Collinses, Dean Whiteheads, and Aaron Nosworthies, have got my utmost respect. They were just a little bit out of the depth. They lacked a bit of quality, but they gave it their all. In the 19-point season, when remember we had 18 points before the turn of the year, and the only one we got after that was from a home goal that's drawn to an out-of-form Blackburn Rovers. That particular season, towards the end of the season, I was walking around the back of the South Stand, and I bumped into Paul Tully, who I mentioned earlier, my counterpart at Newcastle, with a couple of his Newcastle United supporting friends before the game. And Newcastle obviously weren't playing that day. I said, "Oh, hello," I said, "What are you doing here?" They said, "We've come to see a relegation battle." I said, "Well, you can get on the train and go home then, because you're not going to see any battling here. They've given up." So I enjoy most seasons, regardless of how the team are doing, as long as I think the team are busting a gut. If they're busting a gut and they're doing well and they're playing well, happy days. You enjoy it even more. If I didn't enjoy going to the match where we weren't winning, I would have stopped years ago, wouldn't I?
Well, this is it. As would everyone, I would imagine. This might be a little bit of a naive or sentimental question, but do you think the club, even nowadays, can look back to a season like this one and try and look at what worked, the characters that they had involved? I know it's all different in terms of abilities and things like that, but just look at what worked and try and instill that now, or has the game moved on too much?
No, absolutely not. Oh, everybody always likes to say, has the game moved on? I'm trying not to swear. Let's just say the first half of the word I was going to say was bull.
Yeah.
Roy Keane always used to say to me, and he used to say to everybody else, football's a simple game, don't complicate it. And that's coming from Roy Keane, who, in my opinion, is the best midfielder who's ever stepped onto the field in the Premier League game for anybody. Right?
Yep.
Roy Keane, his mantra was, football's a simple game, don't complicate it. So, yes, football can change over the years. A brilliant book that I recommend to people, if you're really interested in the history of football, is a book by Jonathan Wilson, and it's called Inverting the Pyramid. And it is a book that looks right the way from the very early days of football and how football tactics have changed worldwide and what's fashionable. At the moment, it's fashionable to try and play as if you're Manchester City. Now, that's fantastic if you've got players of the calibre of Manchester City. If you haven't got players of the calibre of Manchester City, for me, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Right? I always think of risk and reward. By all means, play out from the back. I've nothing against playing out from the back, unless the other team are more likely to score than you. In which case, I have no problem whatsoever in somebody putting their foot through the ball and getting it over the halfway line and playing the other half. Now, people might think that makes me a footballing dinosaur, but you know what? A lot of people would like to see dinosaurs come back because kids are fascinated by it. So, I think there is always things to learn from the past, and I think you're foolish if you don't learn from the past. I'm not saying you've got to copy the past, but whether you're talking football or whether you're talking life in general, you know, you can learn from what's gone in the past. You can learn about the good things, the things to try and replicate. You can learn about the bad things. Just an hour or so ago, Joe, I opened my inbox, and there's an invitation there from me from Stuart English, who's the head of coaching at Sunderland. Inviting me to come down at the beginning of next season and give a talk to all the academy coaches about the history of the club. So there's some bang up to date from just an hour or so ago, information for you about how the people at Sunderland Football Club now do appreciate the past. They do want to know about the past. They do want to know about the club's heritage, and they do want to see what they can learn from that heritage going forward. It's very, very important that we on the one hand, recognise the fact that we are historically one of the greatest clubs in the history of English football. And secondly, remember that we do not intend that to just be something for the history books. Sunderland have got to continue to get back to being one of the greatest clubs in English football now, in the future. Never mind the team of all the talents in the 1890s or the Rage Carter team of the 30s or the 105-point team or the 1973 team. What we're really interested in is the 2024-25 season team and the seasons going forward. We don't want to become, with all due respect, we don't want to become a Huddersfield Town who are looking back at the fact they won the league title 3 years in a row, a century ago in the 1920s. We've got to think about the Sunderland of the future. If the history of the club can help you with the future, fantastic. But it's the future that's the most important.
It's a fabulous way to draw things to a close, but there's just one thing I do want to ask in terms of this team, just to wrap this up. How do you think that this team should be, and that season should be celebrated?
Sorry, how do you think?
How do you think this team and that season should be celebrated, should be remembered? Because
98-99 team.
Yeah, because I mean they did the second best team to have been in that division.
Well, I would actually argue they're the best team to be in that division. I know Reading got an extra point, and I know that John Oster was somebody who was featuring in that team, for example.
And Graham Murty, ironically.
And well, Graham Murty, while we're mentioning Graham Murty, congratulations to him. What a fantastic job he's done with the under-21s. And I watched that game the other day against Tottenham in the final, and I actually thought Sunderland were the better team, but credit to Tottenham, they took the chances, Sunderland didn't. Yep. But Graham Murty, described in everything as a Reading legend going back to Reading. And, he deserves it. Actually, Graham, quite often at the home matches, James Hunter and I sit next together in the press box, and more often than not, Graham Murty stood just behind us on the gantry where the analysts are, and Graham pretty much gives a running commentary through the game, and it's fascinating to listen to him all the time.
Yeah, it is.
He's terrific. He's done a great job. But I think, coming back to your question, if you put the Sunderland 105-point team on the pitch with the Reading 106-point team, I don't bet on football. I don't bet on anything. Or if I was going to put a bet on, I'd quite happily put as much as I could on Sunderland beating Reading. And Reading were obviously fabulous to get 106 points. I didn't see a Kevin Phillips in the team. Didn't see a Tommy Sorensen in the team. Look, hats off to them. They took 106 points. But for me, it's a bit like saying, well, Leeds better than Sunderland in 64. Leeds pipped Sunderland to the league title. But Sunderland beat Leeds and drew with Leeds in the 2 games. And the only reason Leeds quite pipped Sunderland in the league is Sunderland had a little spell where they were knackered after that cup run. Sunderland were a better team than Leeds in 64.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's a good one as well. That could be worth asking Graham Murphy at some point down the line how he'd see that.
Well, I think he'd probably go for Reading, wouldn't he? Because he didn't really see the Sunderland team. He was in the Reading team. I suppose for you young lads, you might be able to get one of these computer games to do a sort of a computer matchup of the 2 teams, wouldn't it?
No, fantastic, Rob. I can't thank you enough for giving us your time.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you. And I hope that at least some of the people listening to this are still awake and I haven't put everybody to sleep.
And I do just want to say as well, I want to say the tribute that you paid to Charlie early on the final day of the season was superb. Really, really well done, and appreciate that. Yeah. Great words for one of the best, wasn't it, really?
Well, yes, he was player of the century in the club's centenary year of 1979 for a reason. And Charlie was not just a great player, but he was a great man. And one of the things I said about Charlie, and I would say the same about Jimmy Montgomery or Kevin Ball or Niall Quinn, other legends of the club, is one of the things that makes them legends is no matter how good these people are on the pitch, those particular individuals are every bit as good off it. And Charlie certainly was.
Spot on. That's great. And that's a great place to end the show. Thank you very much again for joining us, Rob. And thank you all for listening as well. Make sure you subscribe to We Are Sunderland for £1. And a quick shout out to our sponsors down at the Fans Museum and Prospects Opticians. We'll be back later on with more briefings and hopefully more interviews to come. Thanks for joining us.